I was struck while listening to the dialogue here that we also could have called today's forum after the adage, everything I needed to know I learned in kindergarten. So for those of you who are wondering why a refugee from traditional K-12 advocacy now working exclusively in early education would be at the forum table, it's, you know, I'm just sort of curious for how many people in the room have experience with or are still working in the world of early learning and how it relates to SEL. Because for those of you who are in the room who have been in K-12 and are seeing this as an emerging area, thinking about the world of how we influence social emotional outcomes and development for children is a primary pillar of high quality child development programs beginning at birth and going through kindergarten. So it's incredibly exciting for those of us in the early learning world to see how we can use this as a bridge of communication and of looking at effective practice and systems building between early learning and K-12 education as we're thinking about this same goal of fostering social emotional skills, but instead of in one time period in a student's life and then wondering whether or not there's going to be fade out and the effectiveness of that investment, to be thinking foundationally each year as we're trying to set up children and then youth for success moving forward. So a few things that I saw that were exciting as we were talking today is how we can think about these child-centered systems, how we can think of the relevancy of the pre-kindergarten investment for K-12 systems, if we're thinking in an LCAP world about student-based outcomes, whether they're the SEL-based outcomes you're thinking about in your LCAP or in your SQUE, or you're thinking about some of the harder outcomes around graduation rates and the achievement gap, how effective strategies like early learning, which is an evidence-based strategy to move the dial on social emotional issues, how that can be integrated into an LCAP or K-12 intervention strategy. Thinking about the bridge of teacher education, so getting to this issue of how we're embedding effective practices into professional development and certification. These issues of social emotional development are core in the way we measure with evidence-based, research-based. We have measures around the effectiveness of child and teacher interactions in the pre-K space. I think it's a very interesting question of if we're concerned about how to measure social emotional development in a way that doesn't compromise our actual goal. You know, if we're worried that a measurement of attendance or chronic absence or dropouts or suspensions may not be the right measure, because I think I heard a lot of question marks about that, which has huge implications when you're looking at LCAP and whatnot. Are there other measures we could look at that we are using in the early learning sphere to help support you with that, like the class assessment and other things that we do to use that child-teacher nurturing interaction quality level as the proxy for social emotional development because of the evidence link. The other thing that I was excited about is this link back to Common Core that was mentioned by the audience. As an advocate for Common Core implementation, one of the things I know so many folks were excited about was this thoughtfulness around preparing students for life. And so while so I see SEL as being an integral piece of that, I think it's no coincidence that it's the core districts who were some of the biggest advocates for Common Core implementation and investment, who are also some of the biggest investors and proponents of SEL. And so how can we be thinking about Common Core, not being worried about what I'm thinking about from an early learning advocate's perspective, how we're kind of worried about how Common Core is going to try to push down drill and kill into the earlier years, and the kindergarten is going to start looking like second grade. How we can think about it in the opposite. If we're thinking about SEL values and standards, what can we be doing in K through 3 that is more child-centered, more child development oriented, because of the best practices we've already seen in research that's in highly effective pre-kindergarten classrooms and other kinds of child development strategies. And finally, how can we utilize TK as a ripe opportunity to build this bridge very effectively when we're thinking about in a traditional school district-led space, how can you be utilizing what is presumably an extra year of public education for these kids? How can we be thinking about the child development appropriate foundation for that? And instead of thinking of it as soft skills, thinking of it as a strong foundation for all of the kids for success. So.
Thank you. I tend to struggle, quite frankly, with broad concepts and getting people out of their silos and trying to explain this in a direct policy, what is a change in law way to the people I serve, members of the legislature, particularly in a statewide context. So I'm really excited to have heard a lot today that I think really dovetails with some of the conversations that we are having and have been having. Again, to get people out of their silos, to think a little differently, to change culture, quite frankly, which is very difficult, as we all know. So some things that, again, struck me that I think the opportunity is ripe. We heard a lot today, well, a little bit today about community schools. Again, the whole child, and not just reacting to reactions, trying to understand what's going on in children's lives and their families' lives in the larger community, and bring people together and, quite frankly, care about each other. That is something that, again, is very, I think we have not seen enough of that, whether it's through legislation or just conversation. So I think, again, with these opportunities, it's ripe with LCFF, LCAP evaluation rubrics, which I really keep coming back to. What will these rubrics do? What value will they provide? Will they be used? Will schools use that opportunity to get information about things that they haven't really looked at before? And not, again, back to the silos, not seeing it as something on top of or extra or we don't understand it. It's just embedded in how we relate to each other as human beings. So again, I think there's a lot of opportunities, a lot of work to be done there. Even things with like multi-tiered support systems. The budget just included $10 million. We're talking a lot about, again, RTI, positive behavior intervention and supports. We're having discussions about Prop 47, using the savings, again, through education to reduce truancy, to help support kids that are at risk of dropping out. And that leads me back to some things I keep thinking about. It's not just typical kids at risk. I do a lot of volunteer work with foster kids, and this is exactly the kind of thing that I spend a lot of time doing. Just trying to explain to them, you need to care about yourself, care about other people, strangers care about you. That's a very strange concept to them. But again, bringing back that it's all kids. We've gone out and visited very high-performing schools. They look great on paper. They have high suicide rates. That's so incredibly disturbing. So I think, again, it's an opportunity of moving a little bit away from just high-stakes, standards-based, standardized tests, test scores, accountability, to not lose sight of the value that those things can provide, particularly looking at subgroups. But again, bringing in caring about people, building capacity, improving together holistically. And again, a lot of the policy implications to me comes back to building that capacity, helping schools, professional development, and people are totally right. How do we do that? Sustain it, replicate it, particularly in the LCFF world. That definitely concerns me. Again, some of my ideas would be professional development, but we have one-time funds. So I've heard a lot of discussions about things that really meld nicely with what we're talking about under the dome, but yet obviously I'm very, very nervous, as I think we all are. How does this translate into policy and action out in schools?
Thank you. Carrie.
Hi, yes, thank you. One of the things I heard a lot today, both on the panel and just side conversations at the tables, was that this isn't new. We've been having this conversation for years, and it's existed in lots of spaces, from youth development to the way teachers have approached just teaching for a long time. So why are we having this conversation as though it is something new? And I think what's happening is that it is a little bit new in the way the policy conversation is unfolding. There is an emerging recognition that the things that we might value on the ground in districts and in schools as educators, as after-school time providers, are not the same things that our policy systems signal are the things that we value. And so I think this debate and this attempt to reconcile those two things is what's particularly interesting about where we are right now. How do we build appropriate accountability systems and policy infrastructure that incentivize and support good practice without stifling all the good things that we want to happen? One of the conversations that we had at my table that I found interesting was this fear that policy would get involved. That, what is the role of the state, and is the state going to do anything good for this work? And I think it's a really legitimate question. And as an organization that advocates for students of color and low-income students and English learners in California and tries to eliminate opportunity and achievement gaps, we really think about the role of state policy and ensuring that there is kind of a minimum standard, a baseline below which no student can fall, and that there are protections in place. But there are also the freedoms for districts to go far beyond, innovate, and do all the good things that they need to do in order to help students achieve high standards. So I think the accountability conversation is particularly important and really interesting in California right now. I actually think California is a little bit ahead of where other states are. I agree that we probably aren't where most people would like us to be, but as the federal accountability conversation has unfolded, a lot of eyes are on California. And the fact that we developed 8 state priority areas that include parent engagement and student engagement and school climate, in addition to student achievement, signal that we want to go in that direction. And there are a lot of federal policymakers who are curious and interested to see what California comes up with. In regards to the LCAP and local accountability, I think this is a nice way in which we can test, and I'm going to use the word innovate again, kind of develop innovative solutions around systems of measurement for things like character, self-discipline, all these things that we're talking about, grit. I will share that I have some concern and hesitation about building those things too quickly into systems of state accountability. It's easy to get it wrong and to diagnose the wrong things and assign labels to students or create the wrong incentives. However, I do think what's happening in the core districts has a lot of promise and is something that we should look to. I'm glad that it's happening at the local level and not at the state level to start. I also think that the core districts are sort of in an advantageous position in that they can create a framework that's not yet all the way filled in. So they've been able to say we care 40% about socio-emotional, but the truth is there aren't yet good measures and data that are having stakes and decisions about those schools and districts. So the sentiment is there, but the measurement hasn't caught up. I'll be interested to see, once the measures are there and there are kind of strings or stakes attached to that data, how the conversation changes, if at all, in those districts.
Thank you. So I'm going to pick up on your concern about the state role, which I think is a valid one, and bring up something that's been discussed a little bit in California, which is around the possibility of developing standards for SEL. And there's a couple of other states that have done this. I think there would be a variety of ways to approach that could have awareness-raising purposes and set a set of goals that districts could look to. But I'm curious as to your reaction about whether or not that could be a useful exercise for California. It is something that appeared in Superintendent Torlikson's blueprint for his second term of office. So I think there's some exploratory conversations happening about that. And I'm curious about your reaction to that approach. I don't know which one of you wants to take that first.
I work for the state, but I share your concern about the role of the state. We've actually, I think, been talking, again, about these exact things. Does the state need to develop standards, whether it's social-emotional learning or other indicators, for example, that are right now in the draft evaluation rubrics? And what do we do with that? Say we have a standard, for example, if the standards aren't met, then what? I think, again, that's hopefully the positive opportunities here. Schools need help. We can look to the core districts. Again, I think that's a huge opportunity. Very excited about their work and anxious to see what those measurements are. And again, I think, what do we do with that information, the data? Do we help people? Do we intervene in a positive way? Do we build capacity? Or do we ding them? Do we assign values, numbers, ratings? I personally think that would be very anxious as well.
I think Lynn nails it. It's what's the purpose of the standard? Is the standard, like with some of the other standards we have, around just providing a framework and an umbrella in an area of interest because we want it to be elevated, and we want to have the idea of guidelines for what excellence is to be promoted at like a blueprint across the state? Or is it to lattice accountability and other kinds of things that may not be intended? So depending on what the intent of your standard is, and being very clear about that from the beginning, it can have great benefit. But if it can be utilized in a way that pushes you towards measuring the wrong things before we're ready, it could have huge consequences.
I really don't have anything to add, except that I agree with my panelists. I think we have to be really careful with new measurement. Because LCAPs introduce lots of new local measures, it's a really great place to try things out. What I would love to see are some optional but standardized measures that emerge. For instance, if we find a few different ways to measure SEL that are part of this, Westside has talked about potentially a selector tool, where districts can choose to add to their LCAP one of several standardized measures. What that would do is start to collect data across the state that would allow us to kind of test out what it tells us and how it relates to other outcomes and indicators without folding it yet into anything like a school or district rating or having interventions triggered by that information. So that might be a kind of softer way to start.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask you to put on kind of a policy-making hat. I know one of you, well, all of you could be considered in a policy-making role, whether it's an advocacy role or a real policy-making role, an official role at the state. But based on what you've heard today about how the work of SEL is playing out in schools and school districts, and I think the increasing belief of how the importance of how fundamental this is to a lot of other things we're trying to accomplish, and this came up with Common Core, and it came up with linked learning, it comes up in early ed. If you had to pick one thing to do in state policy to promote this concept in a responsible way that wasn't heavy-handed, either through incentives or resources of some kind, what would that be? What would be the one thing you think might be useful to do in the near term to promote the concept?
So I'll start. And I actually wouldn't constrain this just to SEL, but I think there's an opportunity to learn from what other districts are doing. We published a report on African American achievement a couple of weeks ago called Black Minds Matter. And one of the things we did is we went around the state and documented emerging or promising practices for serving African American youth. And we ended up profiling 4 school districts. One of the things we heard from them, not a single one focused on a single indicator, A to G or graduation. They focused on that as a lagging indicator, but all of their practices and interventions were very much SEL practices. Mentorship, extended learning time, investments in culturally relevant pedagogy, social workers, social services, health and wellness. These were all part of the supports, in addition to things like financial aid counseling and help accessing the right courses to go to college. But some of them are working in isolation. I think the role of the CCE could be really powerful if we start to pair these districts together so they share practices, not just at the kind of the cabinet level, but at the specific program level. So we talk about those who are trying to address the needs of foster youth or English learners or African American youth. What are the practices and strategies they're using? So I think some investment in greater budget for CCE could be a good start, and specific focus on some of these areas like SEL.
I wrote down professional development and collaboration, so ditto.
Yeah, completely on that. I had written, I think someone in the audience had called it teaching practice catalysts at some point. And so if there was a way to think about how to embed this in a deeper way, maybe providing a framework for each of the spokes, and I give the suggestion knowing how incredibly thorny and complicated and difficult it is to think comprehensively about teacher preparation and continuous improvement systems in California. It's not an easy task, but the idea if you were to think comprehensively about a framework for how to embed and catalyze continuous improvement around SEL strategies and culture change, as Lynn had said earlier, as folks said earlier, that would be incredible. even if it was just to provide a blueprint or a framework statewide for school districts for grappling with that goal, knowing how important the child or the student-teacher interaction is, and that is where catalyzing change there is where the rubber's going to hit the road.
Thank you. We're getting close to the end of our time. I know it's been a long afternoon, so I am going to allow our panelists to come up with one final thought they want to leave us with from where they sit about advice for those of us who are taking a lot of notes about where we want to take this next around spreading the work more effectively. So if you could think about one last piece of wisdom you might want to leave us with from the policymaking perspective, and then I'm going to turn it over to David to close us out.
What comes to my mind is, again, something I struggle with daily, is that to educate legislators. And quite frankly, it really makes a difference if they hear from people in their district, their school districts, and with concrete, particularly if you're advocating change in law, concrete language examples, proof, if you will, very direct. I'd say keep communicating, don't give up. You'll end up talking to staff. Don't be insulted. I'd say also maybe start with them in their district. If you're already up here in Sacramento, of course, meet them up here. But I think in their home districts with real people that work there and live there and, quite frankly, vote. That's my perspective.
I think it's about striking at the heart of relevancy. So why it's relevant to a politician in terms of it being important in their district and their home is really key. But also, how is this relevant in the political public education landscape in California? Being really clear that this is not a nice to do. It's not something else we're trying to pile on to an incredibly underfunded and under-resourced, burdened public education system, but it's an evidence-based, effective strategy to get to the same goals. And so how do you message and frame yourself as being relevant to that context so they don't think of it as a nice to do?
I think it would be helpful to hear more from districts about what kind of cover or incentives or flexibility they need from the state in order to be able to do this work effectively. Does an accountability system that includes a focus on SEL allow you to do this, or does it prevent you from doing this well? Does flexibility and funding allow you to do this, or does